Well, it's another Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully, after an hour with us, you will be freer than you are now. I am C Straight, always seeing straight. Chris Stewart, Citizen Stewart on the Twitters, and I've got my brother Sharif El Mekki. Sharif, how you doing, man?
Good morning, bro. Good morning, C Straight. It's good to be here.
Great.
Good to see you. Freedom Fridays. Once again, glad to kick this conversation off, man.
Well, today we're going to have a good conversation. We had a good jumping off point, which is this article from the New York Times written by Shaylyn, Romney, and Robert Putnam. The article, I have dropped it down into the comments for the people that are watching and wondering where it is. It's in the New York Times, December 4th, 2020. It was written by Shaylyn Romney and Shaylyn Romney Garrett, I should say, and Robert Putnam. If you guys don't know Robert Putnam is a famous sociologist who wrote the book Bowling Alone. A lot of what he talks about in his work is how things are done better in a society when they are collective, when there's collective movement and action. Bowling Alone was a lot about how we have stopped doing things together. So, like, we have stopped joining PTAs, we have stopped joining bowling leagues, we have stopped doing things that used to bring us together as Americans. Church participation, for instance, is down. And just there was a way of life at one point in America where you were a member of multiple things. And today, now, it's just you on your own. Like, you're just by your dammy. That actually has been particularly that unwinding of joining things, participating in things, and belonging to things has particularly been hard hit on the people who were already behind socially, financially, economically, politically, including people of color. And, break it down even further, Black Americans. This article that we're going to talk about today, it's an opinion piece called "Why Did Racial Progress Stall in America?" The answer may show us the path out of our fractured and polarized present. There's some startling claims. I consider them startling. You can let me know if you do too. The life expectancy gap between Black and white Americans was narrowing more rapidly between 1905 and 1947, more so than afterwards. By 1995, the life expectancy ratio was the same that it had been in 1961. This is an argument for how we were making more progress prior to the civil rights movement than after. The Black-white ratio of high school completion improved dramatically between 1940s and the 1970s. Again, more progress before the civil rights movement. Racial integration and K-12 education at the national level began much earlier than often is believed. It accelerated sharply in the wake of the 1954 court decision of Brown versus Board of Education. But this trend leveled off in the 1970s, and then it was followed by a modest resegregation, he says. It's interesting on this one point because we are told that integration is the only thing that worked.
Mm-hmm.
We're told that after 1954 didn't happen right away, but somewhere in the 1970s, I've heard Nicole Hannah-Jones be very fuzzy about the time when it actually worked, the time band. But if you were to ask her, I bet you she would say for a short amount of time in the 70s, it was accelerated and working, and then didn't in the 80s, in the Reagan 80s, and stopped. This says that it was actually working before and actually slowed down after forced desegregation of schools started taking place. So there's a couple other data points here on income by race, racial home gap, the racial gap in home ownership, and voting. And this basically says that in each of those things, there was faster movement progress before the civil rights movement than afterwards, which kind of confounds the stories that we tell ourselves about racial progress and, the apex of our progress being when Martin Luther King gave this speech, and then all of a sudden there were some laws, and then after that everything was better. Anyways, Sharif, I want to bring you in on this, man.
Yeah, man.
Did you find any of this startling or unique or new?
The health piece, was surprising because I just would not have assumed that, the life expectancies and things like that were better, for anybody, right? This is before, hospitals and improvement in medical care and things like that, technology. But to see that was like, whoa, other things I was fascinated, but not shocked. Right. When we read, Up South, which is the story of Philadelphia in a lot of ways, and comparing it to Deep South, just how entrenched things were, how there were collaborators, but not with Black liberation, collaborators with white folks with the idea of like, hey, we need to slow this ship down. Well, like NAACP, they were like coup d'etats in the local NAACP, and where it's like, hey, you're being too assertive in demanding Black liberation. We need to slow this down. A few of us have gotten to where we need to be, so we're okay. We can coast the rest of the way, right? Like I passed the finish line in my head, whatever that finish line is, and so we can slow down the churn for everyone else. And I think this other idea that it brought up was the backlash, that we also saw after Reconstruction, and we're talking about the white backlash that we've spoken about a lot in the past. Then there was a white backlash from, the civil rights movement, and it's still, I think we can't emphasize enough that there were a whole lot of Black people who did not take kindly to Dr. King and his aggressive approach, what they would call aggressive approach to getting to some kind of civil rights.
I mean, he literally had people tell him things like, slow down, why you coming in our communities agitating, so this idea.
We get along here.
We get along here, yeah. Our Negroes are happy. Our Negroes are being fed. I don't know what you're talking about. Why are you coming down here with all that? What I think one of the main points of Robert Putnam's work and this article specifically was to say that the reason for that progress that we were making was that there was a culture of we that stopped existing afterwards. So he has something that he calls like the I-we curve, meaning like there's a period of time where there's lots of collective behavior and active, and you go from being like about I to being about we, and you get a lot of stuff done, and then you go back to being about I for a period of time. So this piece was talking a lot about the or the work behind the piece is really about the collectivism of Black folks, and how it was actually a model for everybody else in some ways. But just take one of those data points, like closing the gap between high school graduation between the 1940s and the 1970s. Now, you can't think of a more segregated time, the 1940s. I mean, come on, you had depressions in there and whatnot. So people were poor. They were they had less in life, and yet they were closing the high school graduation gap during that time of all times. Help me understand, like how right now we have fallen victim to a narrative that says that we're too poor or too broken down or too so many things that we can't expect to be closing gaps right now.
Yeah.
Help me understand it.
I think that, that goes to speak to Black teachers and Black educators and schools that were built and created with Black children in mind. You and Dr. Fuller have told this story, and it's in the education of Black people in the South, where that elderly Black woman had that one copper coin and said, this is all I got, but it's for the education of Black children, right? Like that clarity of thought and purpose is what created schools, what built schools, and what propelled, Black children to be successful in the 40s. So yes, during trauma, during poverty, but she said all of my efforts. And I think that's what was, again, back to this congregation type of effort in communities to focus, the clarity of thought, like less distractions, right? Knowing who the enemy was, right? Knowing with clarity that white supremacy was the enemy and that we had to band together and united we stand, divided we fall. unite or die was really the mantra, including education. And so I would say like a big part of it was Black schools, Black education, Black PhDs, as you bring up, like who are in these schools and saying like, you know what, we won't be successful unless this next generation is well educated. And that's clarity of thought and purpose, man.
Same time, 1940s and 1970s. So you're closing the gap in high school during that time. So there's obviously some thinking around, first of all, Black folks are self-organizing during that time. You just said congregation. I love that word because Dr. Putnam is saying there was more togetherness. There was more collectivism amongst Black folks at that time. And churches were a big part of that. Like, they were an organizing force. So the congregation, in terms of raising money, raising community issues, understanding what kids needed and families needed, the barriers of segregation, making it perfectly clear what your joint problem was. Like, I mean, people like those, we don't have some of these things anymore that they had going on for them. And what's really interesting, I don't know if this relates, but at the same time, you were starting to have like an outbreak of optimism in Black folks. They were starting to have a little bit more. They were breaking some barriers that were visible to each other. Like, you just mentioned Black doctors and whatnot. It was more likely than ever that you would be seeing a Black doctor and that Black doctor would be living near you. And there were things like, the Harlem Renaissance and others. There was kind of like an outbreak of creativity, of letters, of authors and artists and, other people that were coming down the pipe. I feel like we're in the cyberpunk post-apocalyptic version of that when it comes to the Black community. Because I mean, we have Black authors now, but all they write about is a lack of hope. I shouldn't say all they write about. That's too general of a term, but I'm just saying, like, we have lots of books now that are just about the problem. We have lots of awfulizing, even though we have way more than they had in the 1940s and 1970s. We got way more in terms of money, professionals, and everything else.
But less unity.
Less unity. Well, that was the other thing I was going to say too. So, back then you had lots of Negro artists who were in control of their own art because they couldn't get in the white systems. And when they did get in the white systems, they were being taken advantage of. But we have now white corporations, multinational corporations that are controlling even our art. So the messages that come to us, don't necessarily think that just because you have something like hip hop, for instance, which is now a global conglomerate product, right? That isn't fully in our control anymore, that we're being fed even a different set of lies about ourselves. Where's the Langston Hughes right now? Do we have one?
I'm sure we do if we thought about it, but it's like, I think that
we'd have to think about it.
Yeah, we'd have to think about it. Yeah, we'd have to think about it. If you just said like, oh yeah, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, you know what I mean? Like you could just, think of folks. And then when you talk, I'm so glad you brought up like the Harlem Renaissance, where it was so entrenched and everyone's like, oh, iron sharpens iron, right? Like it was that kind of thing, when you read about it and people were talking about like, oh yeah, I was here and then I saw this one and I saw that one. And, whether it was music or whether it was other art form, whether it was literature, and it was just like they were feeding off each other, listening to each other's stories, giving feedback, right? Like, and they had a product that wasn't just entertainment, right? Like it was to challenge, it was to inform, it was to educate. It was to make you angry and make you laugh. Like it was like it had this, this appeal. But I think a big part of it was that they were all together in that, they had created this type of ecosystem. I don't think it would have been as powerful if they were just spread out all over the country. Right. And obviously they were traveling, things like that. But there was an ecosystem that was created, so much so that they call it, they specifically name like, Harlem as the, Genesis. When I was younger, I used to love reading Malcolm's autobiography where he talks about, oh, yeah, I met so-and-so and I went to this club and saw this person and that person was doing this. Right. And something that they tried to recreate in some aspects, You know, and he's like, yeah, Nina Simone and I were neighbors, and we would get together with this person and that person. We're there pushing each other and challenging each other's ideas and stuff. But the end goal was the same, even if they may have approached it in different ways. And I think that's that's just a big part of it's a big part of moving forward, right? Like as soon as so I read somewhere someone was challenging the whole civil rights movement, and they were like, because they were like, it should have been human rights first of all, but they're like, the civil rights was actually more of a consumer rights fight. It was to demand that we get to spend our money where we want to. You take our money. Wow. Like it was legislated for them to force, we want to eat here, buy here, spend here. But what that did was it diminished our power. Like, so
yeah, I think people like when we talk about this, the idea that we may have miscalculated some things during the civil rights movement isn't open for debate. It's like,
yeah, it's like Brown versus Board, right? Like, yeah, you can't talk about this.
No, I mean, in some ways, like, I think about it now, like, Dr. King was years younger than I am now. Like, we think about these as like old, wise people who did something way back when that can't be undone or can't be questioned. But Dr. King himself had doubts, and his private thoughts were like, hey, maybe this is gonna work.
Maybe this ain't work. Maybe this a burning house. Hey, right. You know what? I'm saying nonviolence, but I got 4 shotguns in each corner of my house. You know what I mean? Like, so right. It's deeper than what the facade is, deeper than what we see. Right. And people assume tactics is everything, is always encompasses exactly 100% purity in your thought, in your deep convictions. Mm-hmm. Tactics are like, all right, how do I win? One of the things that Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture used to talk about, is like what he believed the miscalculation of Dr. King was that he was going to rely on them being, seeing these images of people being beat and things like that. He's like, the miscalculation was that your enemy has to have a conscience. Mm-hmm. In order for that type of work. He's like, the tactic is fine if they have a conscience, then you can get them to do the right thing. But what white backlash tells you is, even if it makes them retreat a little bit, it's coming back like a rubber band shot, Yeah,
the moral pity play only goes so far.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So when the white majority starts feeling as though that they are losing something of value.
Exactly.
Then it all changes. So this is why I do believe more in the Booker T. Washington school of thought than the Du Bois school of thought. You get after me.
Don't be clowning Du Bois.
I know I got to clown him because like, listen, it's the same thing between, in some ways, the Malcolm Martin and the Marcus Garvey versus like the integrationists. People call Booker T. Washington an accommodationist, and I think it's like, it's the most facile reading of the history, so I can't really like participate very much in that, because it's like, I know people don't know what they don't know when they say that, when they make it about his accommodationism. He was about an analysis. His analysis was that in a capitalist country, no group of people, not just Black, but no group of people are ever taken seriously if you don't own your own stuff, right? If you don't own your whatever. So you could fight for all the civil rights that you want if there isn't a capital basis underneath them to back them up. Like the dollar is only the dollar with gold backing it up. The United States is only the United States with the military backing it up, right? Like, you can't just have an ideal, the American dream. You better have an American dream with the military, or else you're gonna have a global nightmare, homie, right?
Internally and externally.
So his thing was really like, you better build some things. You're in a capitalist country, and you got this dude up there in Philly talking about like how we should just go for civil rights, because once we have those, the government will be the thing that backs them up for us, and white people will have to see us as equal, and so on and so on. You're not going to be seen as equal. The Italians, the Irish, I keep going down the list, they all realized at some point that you're not a serious player in the United States until you own something, until you have a Chinatown, or a Koreatown, right? Until you have the market cornered on 7-Eleven, gas stations and convenience stores or something. You better own something, right? And I think Booker T got that. I think we all got that. Well, imagine this. I don't know how it was in your family. You may have had one of these things, but not the other. One thing that we had was buy black. So, so I always, as a kid growing up, I just remember discussions about like, we need to get a new such and such, fill in a gap, and somebody would say somebody's name, and my dad or mom would be like, is that a brother? Is that a sister? Blah, 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 right? Like, so if you were going to get an accountant or tax help or this type of help, you were looking for somebody black to do it. My grandfather was also like Buy America, right? He worked at Ford. So I think I've told this story here before. My mom rolls up in a Toyota something, right? I mean, that was a little different.
About to get disowned, boy.
Bruh, it was like a little different back then than it is now. I mean, now it's like whatever. But there was a period of time you roll up in anything except for a Ford, Chevy, or Dodge, and your family like take their last name back from you. But that sense of needing to spend your money with each other, or invest in each other, or own your own things, it might be making a comeback now. I think more people are thinking about that, but it feels like we've gone too far.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely saw it, with this the latest uprising. Saw like it, trickling more and more and more. I think I saw it, during this latest uprising, particularly after the George Floyd murder, where you saw Black people like, hey, buy black, promoting Black businesses. And my thing is like, it shouldn't take a public murder for that to happen. Like, at some point we have to not just look at this stuff as history, but more look at it. Baldwin said right now is history, right? Like stop looking at it as just something to read, something to pontificate about, and look at it as a blueprint. If we look at these things as a blueprint, then I think we'd act very differently. Like you've brought up several times about this idea of the Black spending power, right? And I would say, like, let's just drop the power off and let's just say Black spending, because there's no power if it's not organized, right? And, what do they say? You organize people, ideas, and resources. The organization of it all, that's what builds the power. Right now, we just have Black spending in the $1 trillion zone, but it's unorganized, right? And so that ownership, I agree with you. The spending, if just imagine that. Jawanza Kunjufu came to one of our Black male educator conventions. Well, he came to a couple of them, and one of the things he talked about is like we're the only people that live in a capitalistic society, and we don't teach our children anything about capitalism. Right. And that speaks to what you talked about with Booker T. Washington, just saying like, okay, in this society, how do I protect our own? You have to amass power. You have to own things. And then you have to organize around it.
I mean, I got a lashing from Mama Toya, who said Du Bois was correct when he addressed the history teachers. And
he was correct in a lot of things, but
he's probably correct about quite a few things. But like King, and like Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph or whatnot, I'm not going to consider any of these dudes to be sacrosanct when it comes to did the decisions that they make, the bargains that they were striking, were they good forever? Like, were they just temporarily good or whatever? So A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, these others made a big bet on white labor as being our final saving grace. That was a miscalculation. All of the light-skinned mafia that worked on the Brown versus Board of Education, they made a serious miscalculation that once we get into other people's schools, they will see us as human, and all will prevail. We don't need these Black schools anymore, whatnot. Serious light-skinned mafia miscalculation, right? The voting thing. Should we be voters and have voting rights and civil rights like Du Bois, pushed, or should we build schools and build businesses and build banks and build capital? That's the difference between Du Bois and Washington. Du Bois thought that if we could get the handful of educated, talented Negroes educated, that they would lead the rest of the ignorant masses out of the darkness of ignorance. And, well, again, light skin mafia making a serious miscalculation, because where they were coming from, you came out of slavery like Washington did. He said, nah, bruh, we got to own some stuff. I'm sorry. All that sounds good. And that will come. That will come when we own banks. That because once we own banks and we have the collective pool of our own money or whatnot, then we'll be making more progress. This point that Putnam is making is that during these periods of pre-civil rights eras, that there was just such a togetherness. He also makes this really interesting point that all of that progress was really based on the fact that Black people were moving. Mm-hmm. Like they were moving from the South, the Great Migration, and then they were landing into places where they would come together in bigger numbers. So like in these cities, they were starting to expand and make bigger numbers. Again, though, they were starting businesses just like immigrants from anywhere else in the world do today. Come in, start businesses, depend on your community to support your businesses. And, and then all of a sudden we hit this integration wave, and now it's not cool to go to the Black cobbler anymore because there's a white cobbler you could go to.
Uh-huh. Yeah. The Great Migration point was, I think, important. And, we all, what is it? The greatest mass movement of people in the history, millions of Black family. I'm sure your family as well. My family, my paternal grandparents and well, at least my grandmother, moved up from South Carolina, right? Like KKK chased them up. So they were caught up in the wave of the Great Migration, ended up in Philly and New York, right? Found jobs, And the thing, as you said, like they're working together. There's only certain places you can live anyway, right? And so then you're coming up as families. Right now, how often are families now in the same community, right? Like, and then it wasn't just Black people in the same community. You have families. Yep, my uncle lives down the street. My brother lives across the street. Mom lives around the corner, right? Like that's how, that's how it was. I remember, people would chuckle because for the longest time, up to a couple years ago, 4 out of my mother's 5 children lived within 1 block of either side of her house. Mm-hmm. Right. And so, people would chuckle. It's just like, yo, this is real old school. I'm like, yeah, it is real old school. Like, and it just kind of happened that way. But that's how it was. We were all right off of 53rd Street. Somebody's on 52nd Street, somebody's on 54th Street, that kind of thing. But, that's how it was. Now, imagine if we had a business, too. And all of our children are also working in the business, right? Like, and it's recycling back into, and then, the neighbors also had certain things like that. And then others are going to the factories working. So, yeah, I think, as we spread out, or even, this talented 10th, right? Like even taking that out, which we've spoken about, like W.E. Du Bois came to regret that. And he said, and I quote, the talented 10th that he saw would become hard-hearted. Like they forgot. They forgot where they come from. Yeah, like, oh, I got it. I made it. I can be the gatekeeper now. If it's too many of us, then I won't be the special Negro anymore.
I think this point that you just mentioned, all your family living real close together, mm-hmm. that actually is so important because that is your government. That is your system of like, so I just remember my grandmother in the 7th Ward, New Orleans. And I've said this before.
Shout out to all 7th Wards out in these streets.
7th Ward, right? I know when you started your blog, the 7th Ward, Philly 7th Ward, I was like, wait a second, does everybody have a 7th Ward?
Yeah, at one time,
7th Ward in New Orleans is kind of famous for working class, being a working class neighborhood of carpenters and welders and whatever. So one of the interesting things was no matter how much money was in that community, there was very little that was broken. Like broken. Like you go to somebody's house, things were fixed. Like, right. And folks knew how to fix things. They were also famous for being the Creole Mafia, what I call the Creole Mafia. Some of my cousins call the Creole Mafia of New Orleans. All came out of the 7th Ward. A lot came out of the 7th Ward in New Orleans. But we had Taunty Street Taunty Street was one of the streets in New Orleans where I had a lot of family members down in an entire like row of houses, cousins, aunts. But so in the summer, I could dip in and out of any of those houses and eat all day long and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Some of them had small businesses, but they were micro businesses. They'd sell hucklebucks. I don't know if anybody else has.
No, what's that?
A hucklebuck is like it's like a little cup of diabetes. Is really what it is. So,
like a cup of okay.
So there were these Dixie cups filled with like Hawaiian Punch concentrate. Not Hawaiian Punch with the water in it, but concentrated in a cup. They'd freeze them, and then all summer long, you would buy these from one house or another, and you would just like suck on them all day, and straight up just a cup of diabetes. Yeah. Or they would make fudge. That was the other thing. Fudge and pralines. So wrapped in paper. So you got used to there being like these micro businesses of friends and family. You knew which houses sold which. You could dip in and out and eat all day long. I didn't have to come home. I could leave my home in the morning and didn't have to come home to eat, red beans and rice all day long if I wanted it, just about anywhere in any of those places. And I can remember if I was going to go on a trip or somewhere, my grandmother would take me around to see my Uncle Emile and my Aunt Mink, my T-Mink and Tikuni, and just all my family members. I would have to stop by and they would each give me 50 cents, like a 50-cent piece. It was like a ritualized thing. It was almost. Yeah. So like one of the things was you never travel without some pocket money. So that's why everybody gave you like a little change in your pocket. So I learned you never go anywhere without any pocket money, and you see your people before you go on a trip, And these are all things that my kids don't have the same because we're such a monoculture. I mean, my kids have individual Xboxes, right? They can't play on the same Xboxes for too long. And that collectivism is what Putnam is talking about, I think, in that we never wanted for anything. Our family was a store because we lived so close together. If you're cooking, I forgot to get such and such, blah, blah. Of course, they made us runners like we were little slaves.
Go get.
Like, bruh, New Orleans in the summertime is like 1,000 degrees and it's like 1,000 points humidity,
Yeah.
It'd be like, go to T. Cody's house and get an onion.
Man,
like,
I experienced, I growing up in Iran, it was different type of heat, man. I was fine, play soccer while I'm fasting, running around. Man, I experienced a negative summer. They said it was one of the hottest ever, man. But I was like, this is uninhabitable. This, it needs to be another. Like, what are y'all doing there? Man, I walked out like 8 in the morning because they're like, get out early. You want to go walking? I was like, oh yeah, man. 8 a.m. man. That joy hit me like smack.
And did it make you want to ever come back?
I haven't been back. No, I've been to New Orleans, but I don't think I've been in the summertime though.
I don't know what it takes to get us back to this point, like where we're back to good in terms of like family being the central thing. Yesterday I was on a panel at AEI. It was very conservative audience and whatnot, and this thing around family comes up a lot. And I don't think we have figured out a way to talk about the importance of the family unit without running into respectability politics. And I think that's one of our problems. So to have that conversation, we have to have it in a way where we're not having the conservative, if you would just stop having babies conversation.
Yeah.
That ain't gonna help anybody. And plus I think babies are a blessing from God. So for anybody to I don't understand the argument that, the pro-life argument that babies are so precious and a gift from God and they have a heartbeat and all that stuff. And then the moment that they're born, you don't give a damn about the mom, right? Like talk about
or them by the time they get to school.
Okay, see, you done took it to another place, right? Honestly, true, right? Pro-life all the way up until the birth. And then after that, it's kind of like pro, you on your own type of thing or whatever. But we do have to have a talk about I don't know. I don't buy it 100% when people say that the families were much more intact back then. I just want to say there was much more community around you, no, regardless of what happened. Because I remember all kinds of families where the dad had passed away, or there was a big accident, or I mean, there were all different kinds of family configurations. I remember, but they weren't alone.
That's the thing. I mean, I think that's the point, right? Like this idea that, families were always, we have to stop looking at, white history and conflating it with ours. Our families have not always been bloodline, when we just look at, just the history of ripping folks apart, during enslavement, that didn't automatically stop with the Emancipation Proclamation. Like the terrorism that happened still caused people to, be separated on so many different ways. The idea that, people had to leave their families just because of the economic oppression and have to go to another city to try to work and send money back. Right. This whole idea of, people being in such a depth of poverty that people would informally adopt not just bloodline, but other people to support. Right. Like, so I think the configurations were, very different and creative. But it was still this unification that like, hey, leave no brother or sister behind. I think that was the piece that was still going on. It was still multi-generational homes. They were still, oh, that's my cousin. Is it your real cousin? No, but we grew up together.
Right? What? We never did real and unreal.
Exactly. It was just like, that's my cousin. You're like, all right.
I can remember moving somewhere and hearing somebody say my half brother or my half sister. And I can remember it being the first time I had heard it. Outside of New Orleans, like someone saying that. I remember thinking, yo, half brother. That felt like kind of pregnant. Like, I'm kind of pregnant. Like,
it's your brother or not? It's your sister.
Yeah, it's your brother or not. Yeah. Is that your family or not? One of the things that Putnam talks about in his article that I think we don't have a very good analysis for as a people, just in general, is white backlash. I think we know it when we see it. I don't think we build it into our plans. So like we march on Washington, we get these rights. Let's plan for what the white backlash is going to be so that we know how to act. We get freed from slavery. We're emancipated. There's going to be this thing called Reconstruction. Let's plan for what the white backlash is going to be once they see us walking around town looking free, right? Because like that walking around town looking free is about to get you,
Man, that uppity thing was, you got a car? You got what? You got businesses? You're Black Wall Street? Like what? Like,
well, and that's the one thing that I don't think that we pay attention to, is that your success is stripping some white people of the one bargain that they made with America, which is, at least I will always be better than them. So that is the white bargain. The white bargain is, if you get into the brotherhood of whiteness, you will always be ahead or above groups of people. You will always be above them, at least. Now, I might be a billionaire and you might make $2.50 an hour, but at least you're still going to be better than those people. And then they're walking to their $2.50 an hour job, and they see you, a Negro, drive by in a car with the window down, drinking a Coke.
For your Sunday drive there in the country, right?
Listening to Cab Calloway and saying, howdy, howdy, hi. And howdy, howdy, hi will get your ass killed, because your black joy in that moment of having worked hard for your little Chrysler that you have, and your little thing that you're on, you are driving by somebody who just figured out that the bargain that they made is being broken, and you're breaking it. And I mean, maybe after 8 years of Obama, that's what gives you Trump.
And whatever they were promised, that you took it, right? Like, because that's the other part of it. Like, oh no, yeah, we know yours is coming, but they got it. They took it. They're coming for it, right? Like, and that's how other people. That's the easiest way to other people, is to make somebody think that they have what you are supposed to have. And you do that across racial lines, right? Like, that's the history, right? Like, you can have an aristocrat. When you look at like the small percentage of people who actually owned, slaves, who actually participated in, directly, right? I'm talking about the plantation owners. That was a very small group. But the beneficiaries of it, right? Like the white beneficiaries of it, like also got it, right? Like if I don't own slaves, but I run the auction block, or I'm the jailer, or I'm the overseer, or I'm right. Like, so it's a whole system, right? And so a lot of times people are like, oh, well, just them. Like, nah, it's a whole system.
Okay. Now that is a point of all points there, right there, Sharif, because I make this point all the time about schools being part of the system of social control and public employees being the workers, today's version of what you just mentioned. And people don't make the connection when I say it sometimes, and it sounds dramatic. But I do honestly believe what you just said was the beginning of us as an industry. The auction block owner, the person who made the wood blocks that they used at the auction to put you on the auction block, had a contract to do that. The person who transported everybody, whatnot. You didn't have to be a plantation owner to be benefiting off of the trade of people, right? The movement of their bodies. And today's version of that involves prisons and police officers, just like there used to be back then, night patrollers who would round you up for useless things and put you in the system. Let's get you in the system. The first thing a cop asks you today, oftentimes, especially young Black kids who don't know better, is, do you have ID? Not because you're suspected of a crime like you should be, for a police officer of the state in a free state to ask you for ID. But the first thing they want to do is enter you into the system. On a useless stop, you could be spitting on the ground, jaywalking, whatnot. Let's get you in the system as a push. Once you're in the system, the database starts doing things. And we've had fights here in the Twin Cities around the gang database. So you're not a gang member, but you're in the gang database because you could possibly be. So they're looking at your tattoos, if you have one. They're looking at how you're dressed, any identifying marks, just to get you in the system, just to get your info there, your data started. But that data actually starts with your school. If you have cops in your school, you're more likely to have contact with cops, which means you're more likely to be criminalized before you're even out of school. So schools are no longer the school to prison pipeline. They're the school and prison kind of connection or nexus. Like that's different than what other people are experiencing. You have no cops in their schools. So your social workers, your teacher's mad at you one day, turns you over to the cop, or gets pissed off because you got mouthy or something like that or whatever, and you're in the system. The teachers, the people who have the contracts to clean the buildings, all of it is an enterprise, and you are the product. The product is not education. You, the person, is the actual product. That's the thing I don't think we get about urban schools that haven't taught anybody in several generations. That ceased being a school years ago. That's a treatment facility, and you're the product. Just like on Facebook or Twitter or any of these where you think you're getting a free service, you're not getting a free service. You are the product. Your data, your information, your body of information is the actual product. In a public school that has stopped being a school in the 80s, but still keeps getting kids and pushing them through, that has become a profit center. So white schools are cost centers. It costs because they are actually trying to educate children, and that costs money. Many of our Black kids are being processed in these treatment facilities that masquerade as schools. But everybody from the janitor and everybody else, and that person could be white, Black, or whatever. Now what has changed since the auction block day is now that more people can profit. So you go trying to make a change to that school, like, hey, maybe some of these kids don't want to be here no more. Maybe some of them actually want to be educated and go somewhere else. Everybody who has a contract with that building has a vested interest in making sure that your Black ass don't go anywhere else. Right? Now, how is that not the same damn system?
Listen, when Lerone Bennett said an educator in a system of oppression is either a revolutionary or an oppressor, that means like folks got to make choices. Like, and I think to your point, it goes even beyond the educator, so to speak. It's the entire whoever even touches this ecosystem. I've said this a lot. Between my grandparents, both sides, they had 8 children. Some of the schools that were in their neighborhood are the same schools that I, as a, their grandchild, was part of trying to turn it around, because it was doing the same way. They opted out back then. They ain't had no money. As I mentioned, my grandmother came up as a child through the Great Migration and ended up in the school, and they're like, oh, we can't put our kids here. Like, and for me, they're grandchildren, right? And so the decisions, that I'm making about my child, their great grandchildren, and it's the same building structure. Like, that's just unimaginable, right? Like, that's unimaginable. And we're constantly saying, like, well, look at that country and look at that poverty and look at that. No, let's look right here, right down the street, right here in Tioga, right here in West Philly, right here in North and South. Like, it is a consistent.
Bro, where's Tioga?
Tioga is in North Philly.
Okay, all right. That sounds like that would be somewhere like in Ohio or something.
Oh yeah, no, we got a Tioga neighborhood.
Okay.
Nice town in Tioga. That's where Elaine Brown is from the Panthers. Elaine Brown.
Really?
Yeah, she grew up in Tioga, nice town section.
No, I thought she was from Oakland.
No, she moved there. She stayed there. Yeah.
But she was actually from Philly. I think you're just trying to get Philly in the story somehow.
Listen, I don't know how I always end up trying to do that, but it is what it is.
One of the things that Putnam talks about in his article about what went wrong, he talks about how all the way up into the 1960s, there was a weism, like we, and in the 1960s, things made a turn. So he says, a central feature of America's I decades has been a shift away from shared responsibilities toward individual rights and a culture of narcissism. Economic inequality has skyrocketed, and along with it have come massive disparities in political influence and a growing concentration of political economic power in the hands of a few billionaires. And then he starts talking about polarization, and he eventually gets to tribalism and what he calls a war of the we's, which means the small groups. So he's getting into like identity politics, fighting each other and warring each other. And that's what he says that was our undoing. What do you think?
I think a part of what he would also, and I don't know, I do want to get the book and read it, because I'm wondering if he would also say, and I've heard this before, right? This argument of, one, I don't, when they say define we, I don't know if they're always including everybody in the we, right? Like, because I'm like, in the 60s, even if they passed certain laws, it wasn't a we, right? Like there were some folks who may have said like, hey, I don't like what I see on TV, so yes, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. And we had some riders, right? We had some folks who were like, yeah, I'm participating in Freedom Summer. I am going to put myself in danger, like, like that kind of thing. I'm talking about white people. But I don't know if it was this collective national consciousness to do right by people, right? Like, I think they saw some kind of benefit. I think one, that consumer right, like, oh, we can actually get their dollars too. Like, wait a minute, we don't have to, like, we can actually use that, right? Like, it's capitalism, also, right? Like, we can't forget that. Like, all these decisions have to be looked at from, the context of the country. And so the other part,
he doesn't touch on Derek Bell's entrance conversion. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
No.
He doesn't touch on that at all.
Yeah, and so I think like the idea of when he says, put down your we, he would say, there's no place for Black nationalism, just join, right? And then another argument that he makes that speaks to your point that you're raising is that, he said, if we're going to make progress, don't try to do it through racial lines. Don't talk about race is kind of how I interpret it. And I have to read the book to see if it's, I don't want to just make a, assumption based on the surface, but that's what it sounded like. The only progress that you're going to make is if you don't talk about race. Well, if we don't talk about it, they definitely won't talk about it. And so how is the solution? If the problem was constructed based on race, how does the solution not address race, right? Like I wrote an article a little while ago, talking about this Marshall Plan that needed to happen, really just championing this idea that the Urban League, National Urban League had brought up years ago, right? And what I wrote in it, to get it published, they edited this part out. So I got to put it on the 7th Ward, in its true form. But one of the things I put in here is like, whatever solution that we have, whatever this, that Putnam is talking about, we actually have to make it white proof. We have to make it white proof. If not, it'll die with Reconstruction. After this Biden administration, we will have, whether it's Trump or someone else like him, who's still going to be behind the scenes organizing, right? They're going to be organized. Their thoughts, their ideas, their money, their people, they're going to be organizing behind. So what does it look like 4 years later? And whatever solutions we have, Reconstruction wasn't white proof. Brown versus Board wasn't white proof. The civil rights laws were not white proof, right? Because the backlash came and it erodes whatever progress. So we just had this pendulum, right? And it just keeps going back. So while he says, "Oh yeah, we make progress," but the backlash, like this is what's different. And we've talked about this. Like we can actually plan if we get organized for the pending backlash. Folks are mad. 70 million people are mad that their candidate lost, and the new candidate is not going to necessarily put. I think he's looking at like, hey, we don't want the powers that be is like, hey, we don't want a white backlash, so let's be centrist. Let's bring the nation together. Like, and I understand that as a tactic, but what I'm saying is, as the Black experience, that ain't gonna work.
Everything that you just mentioned to me, though, requires us going back to the Booker T. Washington discussion. The only white proofing that you can do is to build your own gardens. Like if you are dependent on somebody else for your carrots and for your peas and whatnot, and you keep trying to pursue new plans to make them share their peas and their carrots more with you, rather than just planting a damn garden.
By proving your humanity, share with me because I'm a human being.
Yeah, you keep owning the garden and you keep giving me my vegetables that I need for life. But I just want you to be more fair about it. Okay, yeah, well, we might be. You get to keep shopping with us, right? You get to keep shopping with us and buying from us and whatnot, which is what the civil rights movement was not. Number one, you said it early in the conversation, not a human rights movement, because humans own their own means of existence. That's the difference between a human and a civic being. A civic being is a function of law, is a function of the state that you live in. So if you identify yourself as a civic being in total, then whatever that state does, whatever to redefine you, blah, 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 that could define you outside of your human rights. It could define you outside of your ethnic or, any other things that you hold dear, rights. But none of these plans are ever predicated on the idea of we're not going to be good until we own it. We're not good. So the idea of that, like I just get the vote, but you still get to determine how to gerrymander the the districts, and you still get to decide how many polling locations there will be and where they will be. How did I win? What did I win? Right. And if there is if there's a person who's donating to you and to your campaign, and I'm donating nothing because I don't have anything, I don't know anything or whatnot, we're in two different power dynamics there. I'm just gonna be basing myself on your generosity.
Yeah.
Anyways, I know you got to run soon because you're always in demand to do these big things with other people or whatnot. Let's wrap this up. So my final word on this would just be simple, just to say that I think it's really interesting history lesson for people to understand that oftentimes the big story we're told, like the civil rights movement happened, all these people swirled together, and then life was different afterwards, need challenging. These simple stories need challenging. We need to go back sometimes and actually be a real students. As adults, we're not in school oftentimes anymore, but we still need to be kind of real students of the background and the history. I love Putnam's longer view of history, saying that no, actually there was a lot of progress that took place before the civil rights movement, and here's why. That's a good story to tell. I do believe collectivism to a certain extent, and sticking together, buying from each other, building our own gardens and building our own institutions will always be, I think, the way out of most of what we're facing as problems. So that's my wrap up. What about you? What say you, Sharif?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. People often say, like, if you can't feed yourself, you'll never be really free, because that means that sustenance can always be cut off at the whim of the next person, the next mayor, the next congressman, the next president. And so I agree, like this idea of history, not just taking the narrative, the popular narrative that, hey, and just imagine what, Congress was at that point, to pass legislation, and to think that it was all solely because they cared about you as a people. We have to look deeper into that and what happened before, then. They will want to discount that self-determination is a big part of what will lead to our success. And we can't discount that. Don't just look at it as history. Look at our history as a blueprint. You are history.
Your history. And where's your paper? Where did that get
published? It was in the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Okay, so for people looking for Sharice's latest piece on Black folks having a Marshall Plan, you should look that up because it's a good piece. Actually, I think reading those two together with this one actually would be good combined reading. Well, it has been another awesome Freedom Friday. It's Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you are freer after this hour of discussion with us. And hopefully we can be free together at some point in the near future, which means we have to start buying from each other, start living as if we matter to each other, and get back to some of the collective activity that made us strong in the past. Thank you, as always. Have a wonderful revolutionary weekend. And by revolutionary, take some time out for you. Yeah. Rest, relax, come back next week, super bright, super strong. And as always, we will have another Freedom Friday. Thank you so much for joining.